objective is distorting the part of the natural hydrograph we want to restore. Multi-purpose dams are generally operated with a hierarchy of objectives. The overriding imperative should be flood control. A prudent dam operator will not increase the risk of flood damage to eke out a bit more water supply or power. The second priority will generally be water supply. Crops, once planted, will generally not be allowed to wither in order to reserve water for power generation later in the year. So power is often generated rather opportunistically, as water is released for higher priority purposes. Historically, keeping the downstream river in good condition has been the last consideration. Reoptimization will change that.
So let's take dam operations and restoration tools in that same order of priority and look first at flood control operations. Let's go back to the natural river system. Recall how rivers naturally have high flow patterns that often inundate the surrounding lands for a while and then recede, producing an array of ecological and livelihood benefits. Now let's insert a flood control dam to protect the people who live next to the river. Let's also add some downstream levees to wall off from the floodwaters the vulnerable floodplain structures and crops. Here you see the floodwaters entering and contained by the reservoir. Because we can't forecast the timing or magnitude of big storms very far in advance, quite a lot of empty reservoir storage must be reserved to reduce the risks of a catastrophic flood. Some of the water is allowed to flow out, but only the volume that will not create flood damage downstream. The levees wall off the surrounding lands so that larger fractions of the floodwater can be released. But containing the typical flood events attracts additional settlement near the riverbank and behind the levees. Here you see the human settlements becoming denser. A small city sprouts with roads and bridges. Fields are converted to permanent orchards and vineyards. None of these would be possible without the elimination of the annual floods, of course. Ironically, dams and levees make floods less frequent, but can actually make them even more catastrophic when they do occur. That is because they induce people to build structures or plant permanent crops within the floodplain on the false promise that the river will not take it back. Both the dam operations and the levee system are designed to control a specified size of flood event. This may be the maximum size floods that occur every 50 or 100 years on average. Yet there will eventually be a flood event that is larger than they can control, maybe 100 years from now, but maybe even next year. And these flood control systems require constant and expensive maintenance. It only takes one weak spot in a levee to let in that flood that it was supposed to prevent. Engineers know this when they design these structures. It is the government officials who tend to forget, as they did before the Mississippi River flood of 1993 and again in 2008. Devastating floods also occur in the Yangtze River in China and in the Limpopo in Mozambique. A more sustainable strategy is to discourage or relocate floodplain settlement. That is a key element of the dam reoptimization strategy that we are about to explore.
So now let us see how this flood control system can be reoperated to restore ecological functions in the river. First, let's selectively liberate the river from its levee system so that it can interact with its floodplain.
We can do that by moving the levees back from the river so that a portion of the floodplain now occupied by the farmlands can be hydrologically reconnected. But let's leave the levees in place where necessary to protect the downstream city.
Now it becomes possible to reoperate the reservoir to allow controlled flood events to be reintroduced into this downstream system. Let's see how that would change current operations.
During the rainfall and snowmelt season, prudent reservoir operators will always maintain sufficient storage space, called the flood reservation, to capture the floodwaters as they come down the river. At the same time, the dam operators will want to keep the water levels as high as possible for irrigation and power generation in the dry season. The maximum safe storage level will depend on the rate at which stored water can be released from the reservoir when a large flood is coming down the river. That release rate depends on the capacity of the outlets from the dam and the magnitude of flood pulses that the downstream floodplain can accommodate without damage to lives or property. So we can hold more water in storage for water supply and hydropower if we can release it faster, and we can release it faster if we can flood-proof the downstream floodplain.
To do this, human uses of the floodplain must be restricted to prevent construction of structures or permanent crops. Yet, generally, regulators have not done this well anywhere in the world. Even more challenging is altering existing land uses to accommodate controlled flooding.
The right to temporarily flood private lands can often be purchased. These are called flood easements, and they compensate farmers for deferring planting for a brief period to allow the flood events to come in and subside. Synchronizing the growing season with the flood periods is a common practice in many floodplains around the world, including the Senegal River, the Mekong, and parts of the Central Valley of California. It is more difficult to reintroduce controlled floods into areas of the floodplain that have permanent crops, such as orchards or buildings. Sometimes it is possible to reopen historic flood depressions that route floodwaters around cities or towns. Sometimes it is feasible to build levees around settlements and allow the rest of the landscape to flood. And sometimes it is feasible to relocate structures or entire communities higher up on the floodplain. Where these techniques are not feasible, the existing land uses may preclude or severely limit the magnitude of restoration floods that can be reintroduced into the system.
To be clear, these flood-proofing techniques are designed to allow controlled floods to be reintroduced. They do not prevent the rare but catastrophic uncontrolled floods from occurring, those that overwhelm the reservoir storage capacity. But notice that by removing at least some of the floodplain development, these techniques do reduce the damage that these uncontrolled floods will cause.
Now let's add an irrigation function to this flood control dam. The purpose of the irrigation dam is to store water during the rainfall and snowmelt period so it can be conveyed to the fields during the hot and dry growing season, and also to make food production more reliable by storing water from wetter years for use during drier years. As you can see, irrigation dams affect flows in two ways. They make them more uniform throughout the year, reducing the high flows and increasing the low flows. They deplete flows as water is diverted to the fields. So, to reoperate irrigation systems to improve their environmental performance, we need to counteract both of these effects to the extent feasible. We can create additional water in three ways. First, farmers can reduce the water that is lost on their fields, primarily to evaporation. For instance, by moving from flood irrigation to drip irrigation systems. Second, reservoir operators can capture floodwaters that would otherwise be spilled from their reservoir. They can do this by reducing the water level in the reservoir before the refill season. And finally, groundwater can be used to supplement the surface water if the reservoir doesn't completely refill. The conventional ways to increase storage capacity are to expand existing reservoirs or build new ones. But these are expensive, take a long time, and are environmentally controversial. A better option is to utilize the storage capacity in the groundwater system underlying the farming area, in conjunction with the existing reservoir storage. This is called groundwater banking. Let us show you how all this can be done. To begin, we may need to make two physical changes to the system. First, we need to again flood-proof the downstream floodplain so that it can accommodate environmental flows. Second, we need to drill wells in the farmlands so the farmers can use both groundwater and surface water. Now we are going to create more storage space in the reservoir before the rainy season by delivering additional water to farmers who pump groundwater. When this surface water is available, these farmers turn off their wells and thus reduce extraction of groundwater. When the rains come, the reservoir will fill up again, but because there is now more storage space, a larger fraction of the flood flows can be captured. The rains will also infiltrate and replenish the groundwater table. The groundwater level will also rise because less is being pumped. During the rainy season, we also want to release environmental flows that, together with the uncontrolled runoff from downstream tributaries, will inundate the floodplain in a controlled manner. But what happens if the rainfall is inadequate to refill the reservoir? How can we make sure the farmers will not be shorted? We can assure adequate supplies in these drier years by requiring farmers who ordinarily take reservoir deliveries to leave their water in the reservoir for others and instead pump the groundwater. As long as the groundwater system is allowed to replenish in wet years as much as it is drawn down in dry years, the groundwater levels will remain in balance over the long run.
Very good.